more safe. They hurt our economy. They hurt our country. They limit our ability to speak and think and live and be creative, to have relationships, to associate freely. And they're going, this doesn't make us more safe, it makes us less safe. It puts us at risk of coming into conflict with our own government. And there's a far cry between legal programs, legitimate spying, legitimate law enforcement, where it's targeted, it's based on reasonable suspicion, an individualized suspicion, and a warranted action, and sort of dragnet mass surveillance that puts entire populations under sort of an eye that sees everything, even when it's not needed. This is not about any sort of particular program. This is about a trend in the relationship between the governing and the governed in America that is coming increasingly into conflict with what we expect as a free and democratic people. If we can't understand the policies and programs of our government, we cannot grant our consent in regulating them. As someone very clever said recently, we don't have an oversight problem in the US, we have an undersight problem. That unpredictability can in fact be the origin of our fears, because this is a position invested with a lot of power. But the president does not rule the world, nor does he rule any one of us. We, the individual citizens, the companies that we create, the values that we promote, the systems we build, the conversations that we have, the actions we take every morning when we get up and decide how we're going to move through the day. These are the things that decide our future. And this is critical because when we think about the advances of technology, when we think about all of the capabilities that have been put in place by all of these governments, not just in the United States, but around the world, even in Sweden with their own intelligence, the FRA, and other groups, doesn't matter whether it's Russia or China or France or Germany, or the United Kingdom, which just passed the most extreme surveillance bill in the Western world, and in fact in the history of the West. We have to recognize that governments make mistakes, and that because of this, we need to be aggressive about building safeguards into our system to mitigate the harms, the damages that result from these unpredicted, unexpected circumstances. Now, when we think about how this interplays with corporate policies, right, and the citizen, you go, well, what can I do? I'm not the Prime Minister of Sweden. I'm not a king. I can't make the rules. But in a lot of ways you can. Everybody works somewhere, or in fact most people do. And whether that's at a private corporation or something that you built yourself, whether it's within the government, we can promote change. And one of the central challenges of these mass surveillance systems that we're discussing today is the access to data that they have. If we're talking about the current election as an example, in the wake of sort of the hack of the US political process that we saw where these emails got sent loose, Donald Trump was once asked what he thought about that. And rather than condemning it, he said, and I want to quote the words directly here so I don't get them wrong. This is an exact quote. He said, "Honestly, I wish I had that power. I'd love to have that power to hack anybody's emails, to release whatever he wanted about political opponents or whatever." And now he does. That's the world we live in. How do we fight back? How do we enforce our rights? Not to say Donald Trump is evil, I want to, mitigate him, I want to make sure he's disempowered or whatever, because that's not really the issue. We don't care about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is just a president. It's an important position, but it's one of many. What we actually need to think about is how are those things enabled? And that's when we look at the story of 2013 to today. that all of these companies, all of these internet service providers that we rely upon around the world, whether it's Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Apple, anybody, they've gone beyond what the law requires in the United States to allow the government to sort of rifle through their data holdings. If you're an American citizen, they have to go to a secret court that always says yes and get a rubber-stamped warrant before they can tell Google, we want all of this person's email. But if you're not an American citizen, and this is true today, anybody sitting in this room right now, an analyst sitting at the NSA, such as myself, does not need a warrant from the court. They don't need to establish probable cause that you are engaged in any kind of wrongdoing. Instead, the Attorney General, our top justice official in the United States, goes to that same secret court only once a year, and he provides a list of general activities that he considers threatening to the United States or matters of intelligence interest. And if you meet any of these categories of activities, they can simply, the analyst themselves, can self-certify that these authorities, this is under a law called the FISA Amendments Act, Section 702, mean they can go use these programs to gather this kind of information in response. And this continues to be the case even despite the fact that a few years before, the underlying laws in the European Union that allowed your data to be passed to these US internet companies collapsed. This was called the Safe Harbor Agreement. When they found out the United States was cheating and their laws were allowing them to sort of indiscriminately rifle through this information, they said, we need a new agreement. Well, earlier this year, when it was assumed that the next president would be Hillary Clinton, they passed a new agreement called the Privacy Shield, which doesn't actually require the United States to change their policies in any way. Their laws are still the same. They can still do the same things today that they could do in 2013. It's really a liability shield for companies more than it is a privacy shield for consumers. But now things have changed. That unpredictability came back. And it has never been clearer today, or it is clearer today than it has ever been before, that this agreement needs to be renegotiated yet again. Because now we have a president who's saying they don't really care about these international agreements. They don't really care about this careful balancing of power. They don't care about the consideration of the equities of the other side. They don't really care too much for human rights in general. And if this is the case, how do we defend it? And this is where we start getting back to those companies. The only way that they can truly enforce this, because even the best intentioned company can't resist a government that's happy to jail them unless they're ready to move. But what they can do is limit the information that they're retaining about all of us. There is nothing that says these phone companies really have to keep permanent records or very long-lived records of where your cell phone travels. But they do, because it's cheap and it might be interesting. They might be able to make money off of it. But is it really necessary to the operation of their business to tell where your phone was 3 months ago instead of where your phone is right now? And of course the answer is no. Same thing with internet companies. Do your Facebook messages really still need to be held 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? Or do you need them for 6 months? If companies can start thinking about what is the actual realistic maximum of data that we need to be retaining about our users, they are setting a limit to how badly their service can be abused against the interests of their customers by outside forces. Because again, this is not about the United States. This is not about beating up Donald Trump. This is not about beating up any particular country. Because when one country does this, all countries do this. Russia submits the same requests for information to Facebook. China does the same thing. Iran does the same thing. Sweden does the same thing. They do it at different levels of frequency. But the bottom line is we need to start thinking about how we can protect human rights, not in the context of a single jurisdiction,
not in the context of reforming a single law, but how we can do this globally.
So how would you say, how come we are not doing that? Maybe the question is that we do not, maybe it's the privacy issue we talked about, we do not value that enough, it seems, at times. But you talk a lot about the technical competence that you need, a sort of that it is that knowledge gap that we really need to focus on. You talk about the technical literacy. Is that something that could help? What competences do we need to be better to also roar a bit higher earlier as users as well? Or are we just naive?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think there's a lot of reasons for this, and it's unfair to single out a single one. Technical competence does play a role, particularly in the public's participation in this debate. We saw in the United Kingdom, in the passage of this great mass surveillance law, there was very little protest because the newspapers hardly wrote about it. Many of the journalists didn't understand the law. The government did its best to limit debate about this law, to make sure no one was talking about it, to make sure that every sort of public statement that was released about this or study relative to it was written in opaque language so that the public couldn't understand and only an expert audience could. This puts a gigantic burden on the expert class to kind of broaden the conversation here. And in many cases, they're going to fail. Because again, it gets back to that same dynamic of how the NSA's operations got so bad. When you limit participation to these tiny fractions of population, you're going to get a poorer quality decision than if more minds were involved in arriving at these decisions. But I think beyond simply the thing there, we have companies that are burdened by a profit motive, right? It's natural and it's right. It's proper that they want to make money. That's why these companies were founded, right? Nobody should begrudge them the chance to make a profit. But at the same time, we should think about which companies we want to support. And we should have mechanisms to understand how these companies are operating, the kind of decisions they are making, and the social costs that are being created as a consequence of their operations. Just as oil companies are starting to face criticism, protest, and divestment of investments as a result of the impact of their industry on our global climate, we should have the same understanding of the consequences of these companies' operation on our digital climate. But right now, it's too opaque. We don't see how these things are operating, and it makes it difficult to say who are the good guys and the bad guys. And I think that has to change.
Yeah. So, but that links me really to go back to the US election. What would you say is the role of Facebook and Google in how, not maybe the results, but the whole change of media landscape and the different players that we have at hand when making decision on, for example, choosing a president?
I think, you know, I've spoken about this one before, and the way that I went at it was I said, look, if bad posts on Facebook or Twitter or Google can change the results of our election, that's a sad indictment of our democracy, even more so than it is of Facebook or Google. That doesn't mean that these companies shouldn't be concerned. I don't think we want private companies in a position to decide what kind of speech is permissible and what kind of speech is not permissible in an open global society. Because if Facebook is making intentional decisions about, nope, we don't want people seeing this story, or nope, we don't want people seeing that story, that's a precedent that can get out of hand very quickly. They might be using it in a beneficial way. To protect us from fake news today. But what about next year? What about in 5 years? What about in 10 years? They start to shape our understanding of the world in a very dangerous way. Whereas if it's our friends who are posting these articles, we have somebody to hold to a personal account there, and somebody who has just a normal level of influence. They're not enjoying special powers or privilege or status, but it is a real problem, and this is a difficult question to answer. But I think realistically here, we need to understand what the values of these systems are, what the values of these companies are, and to make sure that it is not governments that are telling them we get to make the rules about what gets shown and what doesn't get shown, because government censorship is even a greater danger than many other structures of power, such as corporations, because as powerful as corporations are, and they are a very real threat, there are alternatives. You can go to competitors. But this is one of those central questions that I think is yet unanswered, is when fake news, when facts that are simply not real, that are made up, but feel right, have become more powerful and more persuasive than our actual reality. What does that mean about our civil culture and our appreciation for real knowledge, meaningful analysis, and ultimately our belief in basic matters of science, which is that all things should be tested, and that that which can be asserted without evidence can and should be dismissed without evidence.
So, but what resources do you see that could battle that? Are we talking about competence? Do you see any other players here? Libraries? Or what do you see ahead?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a very complex space. One of the central things is we have to be aware that these things are actually happening, that it's not speculation, that it's not conspiracy. And this is what we saw in 2013. This is the reason so much of the internet had this soft, exposed underbelly that was so vulnerable to surveillance. Was if you went out in the public and you said that every communication from every person in the world that crossed U.S. lines was being collected and stored and traded around like baseball cards with all of these other countries, even if the government knew it was unlawful to engage in these activities, they'd look at you like you were crazy. There were experts, of course, who knew this was technically possible, but they couldn't prove that it was actually happening. And the distance there between speculation, between suspicion that it could happen, and fact, having proof that it actually had happened, changed the conversation. It changed the internet, and in at least a small way, but a meaningful way, it changed our politics. And I think this is very much the same. When we start to see that these fake narratives actually have a real impact, we become more aware and more armored against them. We become a little bit more skeptical. We require a higher standard of evidence, and this is a beneficial thing. But you mentioned libraries there, and I think that's actually a critical role that we haven't thought about that much. The library system in many countries around the world has been searching for purpose when information has become much more easily shareable, when it has been much more easily tradable. But we can think of librarians as a professional class that are dedicated to the ascertainment of facts, the familiarity of facts. And it would be helpful if we had more public voices and more public institutions that could weigh in a nonpartisan, apolitical way, but help us understand where the resources are and what the facts are that allow us to actually resolve these controversies in a fair way.
What is very clear when listening to you is that, and I think that's so inspiring to hear here as well, is the fact that there are so many professions that need to step up to the game and see what is their role, as well as we as individuals when using these services. So I will let the US election go, but I do know that we still need to ask one question, and that is the fact how your views are on how it will affect your own situation. Is that something you will comment on?
I don't care. The reality here is that yes, Donald Trump has appointed a new director of the Central Intelligence Agency who used me as a specific example to say that, look, dissidents should be put to death. And I think that's a fundamentally un-American thing. But we have much bigger problems than my personal situation. I am the least important part of any of this. My effort to contribute to society had the most impact, I think few would argue, in years prior. I will continue to try to contribute to the best of my ability. But if I get hit by a bus or a drone or dropped out of an airplane tomorrow, you know what? It doesn't actually matter that much to me, because I believe in the decisions that I've already made. I've done my best. I will continue to do my best. And I will not be afraid of these kind of policies that fail to understand the most basic truth of any democracy, which is that dissent is patriotic. It's not treason.
I let them applaud you, so you feel our warmth from here. But let's go back then. When you decided to blow the whistle, you choose to turn to journalists. Why?
Yes. I was concerned about my own political biases because when I was thinking about how we got here, again, sort of the original sin that led us to this series of mistakes, it was that we didn't have enough voices in the room. And when I was making these decisions, when I came to the belief that these programs were actually a violation of human rights, they were against American values, and they had violated not only the laws of the United States, but the Constitution of the United States, that this was an opinion of one. I went to colleagues, co-workers, I went to my bosses, and I showed them evidence of these programs and said, do you think this is right? And of course they went, you know, no, but that's not really our place. And I think, in a way, they were right. It's not the place of any one person alone to make these decisions, because they could be wrong. I could have been wrong. But that doesn't mean that you're silent. What that means is that you try to construct the same system of checks and balances that's supposed to keep our government upright, to keep us as individuals, even as dissidents, to the same standard of accountability. And so rather than acting on my own and publishing information on the internet directly, which I've been criticized for, and it's fair to say, right, this individual's acting as a gatekeeper, they're not sharing everything the public should decide, it's a fair criticism. But I believed personally that some of this information was legitimately classified, but it did also need to be considered in understanding how the operations of all these programs work, where the line was between permissible and impermissible. And so I worked with journalists to remove my own personal political biases from the equation, to mitigate the possibility that I could have simply been wrong or too radical. Because this is the role of a free press in an open society, to contest the government's monopoly on the control and dissemination of information about their activities, and to ultimately measure the balance of equities in those hard questions where maybe it's close about should the public know about this or maybe not, between what the government says and what the public believes they need to hear. And so it was for this reason that I set up a specific system where I shared this information with journalists that I believed showed evidence of criminal activity, of violations of human rights and law. They then would remove me from the process, and they agreed to publish no story that was not in the public interest to know, right? They wouldn't publish something just because it's interesting or just because it's newsworthy, but something that was actually necessary to create a freer and more fair society. And I didn't consider this to be sort of a betrayal of commitment to the public, but rather I believe this to be an indication of faith in the public, of loyalty to our values. To make sure that I'm not just trying to light a match and burn it all down on my own. And then, and this is where it got really controversial, I required the journalists in every case in advance of publication to go to the government and allow the government to argue with the journalists that any detail in the story that they were going to publish could cause harm to a particular individual. Maybe the journalists didn't understand everything. Maybe I didn't understand everything. Maybe we didn't see the big picture. And one sentence in a story might reveal a human agent behind enemy lines in a place like North Korea, right? And put this person in danger. As far as I know, this process was followed in the publication of every story. Now, it's important to note, this did not give the government a veto over the publication of any stories. It simply gave them a chance to make their case to the journalists, and then the journalists would decide whether to publish it or not. And I'm not aware of any case